Will Iran's U.S. prisoners return home? Washington and Tehran have struck a deal to release each other's detained nationals, along with $6 billion in Iranian assets. But will long-held Siamak Namazi, Emad Sharghi, and Morad Tabaz finally see U.S. soil? And is internal and external pressure forcing any reform on Iran's regime? I'm Andrea Sankian. Today's newsmaker is Iran. American-Iranian businessman Siamak Namazi has served more time in an Iranian prison than any U.S. citizen in history. But after striking a prisoner exchange deal 2 weeks ago, he and 4 others might see their own homes as early as September. I say might because Namazi's own lawyer, whom I'll speak to later in this program, has yet to celebrate, saying there are no guarantees. Now, part of the exchange also involves money for Iran, some $6 billion, which would only be used for humanitarian purposes. But can that be guaranteed? And what does this deal say about Iran's position in the world now? Here's a closer look.
I implore you, sir, to put the lives and liberty of innocent Americans above all the politics involved, and to just do what's necessary to end this nightmare and bring us home. Thank you.
Businessman Siamak Namazi has been held in Iran's notorious Evin prison for 8 years. Now, months after that plea to U.S. President Joe Biden, he's closer than ever to returning home. The U.S. has agreed to unfreeze about $6 billion in Iranian funds and release several Iranian prisoners in exchange for the freedom of 5 dual citizens: Siamak Namazi, Emad Sharghi, Morad Tabaz, and 2 others whose names have been withheld. As a first step, Iran has transferred 4 of the detainees from Evin prison to hotel detention. The 5th prisoner was already under house arrest.
While this is a positive change, we will not rest until Siamak and others are back home. We have suffered tremendously and indescribably for 8 horrific years and wish only to be reunited again as a family.
Yet, it is a complex and fragile process. Those Iranian assets are South Korea's debt for a previous oil purchase. First, South Korea will exchange the funds to euros and then transfer them into an account in Doha. And Qatar will control the money so Iran uses it only for humanitarian purposes such as purchasing medicine and food. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Iran will not have direct access to the funds, and Washington will have significant oversight.
Nothing about our overall approach to Iran has changed. We continue to pursue a strategy of deterrence, of pressure, and diplomacy. We remain committed to ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon.
But the Republicans have likened the money transfer to a ransom payment and say this practice encourages Iran to take hostages for political and economic gains. Meanwhile, the Iranian media has celebrated the deal and praised what it calls President Ibrahim Raisi's honorable diplomacy.
The main thing for Iran's government and for diplomacy was to get the necessary guarantees in achieving these 2 goals: to unfreeze Iranian funds in South Korea and release Iranian prisoners in America. We worked hard, and the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran has received the necessary guarantee for the implementation of the provisions of this agreement by the American side.
In 2018, then-President Donald Trump withdrew from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which was formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. After withdrawing, he reimposed sanctions on Tehran.
Thank you very much. This will make America much safer. Thank you very much.
Mostly due to the crippling effect of sanctions, this year the Iranian currency has hit an all-time low, and inflation has skyrocketed. Internal unrest has deepened the crisis. Last year's killing of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in police custody sparked mass protests against the government. So even if restricted, that money could still give Tehran much-needed economic relief. Iran also considers the negotiations a test for U.S. attempts to revive the JCPOA. Biden took office on a promise to restore the nuclear deal. Iran and world powers held negotiations in Vienna for months last year before the talks were suspended. And recently, the 2 sides held indirect talks in Oman. The implementation of the prisoner deal may now help build trust between the longtime adversaries for future negotiations.
So, 2 weeks after this deal was struck, will Siamak Namazi and the other U.S. nationals come home? Well, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said that the deal is on track, but what do those closer to the process think? Well, joining me now with his perspective is Siamak Namazi's lawyer, Jared Genser. Jared, thanks so much for being with us. It is the first public statement the White House has really made since this swap was agreed. So does their confidence give you more confidence that Siamak will return to the United States?
Well, look, I'm hearing the same information that Jake Sullivan said publicly, privately, from our ongoing discussions with U.S. government officials. As I said when they were moved to house arrest, the Americans, I said this is at best the beginning of the end, not the end of the end, and that I'm not going to believe that it's real until the plane is taken off and left Iranian airspace. So my posture on that remains exactly the same. We have to remain vigilant. Both sides need to do what's necessary to consummate and follow through fully on the deal. And I think that so far so good, but we still have at least a number of weeks to go.
What has history shown you about getting too hopeful, especially in Siamak's case? I mean, I'm not sure anyone ever thought he would be languishing in Evian prison for this long.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Namazi family knows better than anybody the consequences of being overly hopeful. Siamak was left behind, the only American left behind, when President Obama finalized the January 2016 nuclear deal, and was promised by then Secretary of State John Kerry that the family was promised that he would be out within weeks, and instead Baher Namazi, the father, who at the time was 79 years old, was taken hostage as well and spent several years as a hostage himself. Under the Trump administration, the Namazis were left behind 2 more times. Deals were struck by President Trump for others who had been detained later, but not for the Namazis. And, about a year ago now, Baher Namazi finally got out of Iran, but his son Siamak Namazi has remained there. So it's been almost 8 years since Siamak Namazi went to jail. And if I had a penny for every time that I heard we were close to a deal, I'd at least have $1 by this point.
Let me ask you this: you have dealt with countless political prisoners. What are your concerns now for Siamak post-release, if that happens? What will he have been through, and how will he adjust?
Well, he spent his first 2 years in Evin prison in isolation and being physically and mentally tortured in really poor conditions, sleeping on a concrete floor with no bedding of any kind in a very, very small room with no toilet, only a bucket to take care of himself. And that has a huge effect on a person. Of course, while the subsequent 6 years were a little bit better than the first 2, he's been in prison for almost 8 years in the prime of his life. And as someone who's both his lawyer as well as his friend, I'm very worried about how he will come out of all of this, as I am with all the political prisoner clients that I've represented over the course of my career. He's going to require a lot of both physical and mental health care, as well as support from many different directions in order to return to his life. But this will always be a permanent trauma on his life, and also a loss of 8 years of his life sitting in jail for crimes he didn't commit.
Right. From what we understand, these are now the last of the U.S. prisoners held in Iran. Do you fear that makes other Americans or dual nationals more vulnerable in the country right now?
Well, I think that what's happening with the resolution of these 5 cases is important to focus on, because the reason why the U.S. has continually had hostages in Iran over many decades since 1979 is because our policy on recovering our people from around the world, not just on Iran, but more broadly, are consistently inconsistent. And by that, what I mean is that we don't negotiate with terrorists except when we do. We don't make policy concessions or pay ransoms except when we do, and so forth. And the only way to end hostage taking as a practice on a state-to-state level is to upfront create a set of draconian disincentives to take hostages in the first place. And so one of the things that I propose is to do a multilateral agreement between the United States and other like-minded countries, where they will come together and publicly say that, if any one hostage is taken from any of these countries, that all of those states will act in a concerted way, and there'll be a set of potential consequences outlined in that multilateral agreement that could then actually try to send signals up front that this kind of hostage taking has to stop. But there are no guarantees that hostages aren't taken very quickly thereafter. Once Siamak and the other 4 Americans are ultimately released from Tehran.
Okay, Jared, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. So conditions for the prisoner swap include the release of that earlier mentioned $6 billion in Iranian oil revenue. Severe U.S. sanctions have prevented Iran from accessing its money abroad, which many argue has hurt ordinary Iranians the most. So, have years of pressure from external sanctions and internal mass protests changed anything for the regime? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Virginia, retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He's also a former Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. From Princeton, New Jersey, is Seyed Hossein Mousavian. He was formerly head of the Foreign Relations Committee for Iran's Security Council and a senior nuclear negotiator for Iran. And from Washington, we have Ali Vaez, the Iran Project Director and Senior Advisor to the President of the International Crisis Group. Thanks all so much for being with us. Colonel Wilkerson, this agreement, it could prove complicated, because dealing with Iran is a political minefield within the U.S. government. So do you think this agreement will be carried out effectively, and at what cost for its advocates?
That's an excellent question. I think the real impediment to it being carried out in the way you described is the U.S. insistence on the way the $6 billion, which legally belongs to Iran, is spent. That might be an impediment down the road, and the deal might go through, but I think it will be an impediment. And when Secretary Blinken says that U.S. strategy continues to be deterrence, pressure, and diplomacy, I say the same thing I say about most of what Secretary Blinken says. Where is the diplomacy? This is a start, but it's a minor start.
Okay, Ali, is that fair?
Well, it is really the minimum that both sides could have achieved diplomatically. And the next few weeks are very tricky because although it is happening in a context that is witnessing less escalation than in the past, but there are still a lot of points of friction, including in the maritime realm, where we have seen several dangerous skirmishes between the two sides. So there could still be a lot of Argo moments between now and when the detainees leave the country. But if this deal is carried out successfully, I think it could potentially be a confidence-building step for more dialogue and diplomacy aimed at figuring out a way of especially resolving the nuclear standoff between Iran and the West.
Seyed, how much of a win do you think this is, and would it be for Tehran if the deal is fully implemented?
I believe the deal is based on President Biden's policy of no deal, no tension, no crisis. It means they are not going to revive the Iranian nuclear deal, JCPOA, until the next U.S. presidential election, but they don't want no crisis. I believe all the issues about this deal agreed between Tehran and Washington is about no crisis, but I think it is positive. Every step to de-escalate Iran-US tension, I consider it positive. But if it's going to continue the de-escalation, no crisis strategy till the next presidential election, about 2 years, and without any agreement on reviving the nuclear deal, I'm afraid it would not be sustainable.
2 more years. So let me ask you, Seyed, will the money, the $6 billion, if it is released, do you trust Iran to spend it strictly for the humanitarian purposes that it's apparently been allocated for?
As far as I understand, every portion of the money would be spent under the supervision of United States with coordination with the Central Bank of Qatar. It is not one shot release of 6 billion. This would be deposited in Qatar Central Bank, and Iranians would be able to order food or medicine, and every order would be supervised and checked by Americans. I think this is what I understand.
It sounds very practical, but Lawrence, we have to remember that sanctions relief for humanitarian purposes has backfired before. The UN Oil for Food program under Saddam Hussein in Iraq saw money being squandered for bribes. Higher-ups in the program were indicted on criminal charges. So how much does that resonate today with members of Congress when it comes to humanitarian relief for an adversary like Iran? Do they trust this money will be used for food and medicine only?
Well, as I saw with the UN Oil for Food program and other programs too, when I was at the State Department, it's very difficult to do this sort of thing, particularly through a third party, in this case, Qatar. I would say also that what I learned from my students, some 400 plus students at the George Washington University and at William and Mary, and teaching national security decision making, often was more than I taught them. And one of the things I learned was that despite our main text, David Rothkopf's book, Running the World, that people are the most important ingredient in decision making, in the United States, domestic politics weighs as heavily, if not heavier. And Joe Biden is caught between a rock and a hard place with regard to the Republicans and their views and his own personal views. And it's going to be very difficult for him to walk a middle road, so to speak, and to try to maintain at least a modicum of peace between Iran and the United States.
But as Seyed said, it's 2 more years, to the elections. So do you think Joe Biden and his administration could just be biding their time before they actually take action on the Iran nuclear deal, knowing that they won't be up for re-election again because of term limits? Do you think that's factoring in here?
Biding their time, yes, and biding their time with the most egregious situation in the world, Ukraine leading the pack, and the fact that Biden can't do anything diplomatically or otherwise until he is assured of re-election. That's what domestic politics do to a president. And these Republicans, my political party, are making it extremely difficult for the president to deviate in any way that might be positive, diplomatically or otherwise.
Okay. Ali Vaez, I'd like to move on to another area of concern here. Less than a year ago, we actually were asking if Iran was witnessing the same conditions that led to the 1979 revolution. The protests were significant as an understatement. Yet here is Iran negotiating deals with some pretty considerable leverage. Has anything changed in Iran? Has the regime's position been emboldened or lost strength because of sanctions and internal pressures from protests?
Sure. Let me just make 2 quick points about your previous question. Number one, this money comes with more strings attached than was the case of the Oil for Food program, and the U.S. Treasury Department has direct oversight over how this money is used. The critics often argue that because money is fungible, even if Iran can only use these $6 billion for purchasing food and medicine, it would open its hands for other destabilizing activities. But by that logic, the principle of humanitarian exemption that exists based on U.S. law would completely be undermined, meaning that Iran would never be able to use any of its own assets because this is not ransom money. I know you have a question mark at the end of the title of this show, but the reality is that ransom is never paid by the hostage taker, and this is Iran's money. There's no money flowing out of the United States. So I just wanted to make that clear. To answer your question, look, I have used the analogy of the Islamic Republic being where the Soviet Union was in the early 1980s, not late 1980s, in the sense that it's a regime that is ideologically bankrupt, politically at a dead end, economically in deep troubles that it really cannot resolve, even with sanctions relief. But it's still a regime that has a will to fight and a fearsome capacity for repression. That was true last year. It is still true this year. And this is why the United States had to, in a very pragmatic way, address some of the key priorities, including the fate of its hostages, and also trying to de-escalate some of the tensions, because the president obviously does not want conflict between now and elections in November 2024. He is focused on re-election. He is focused on the war in Ukraine and potential tensions with China. And the last thing he wants is a crisis in the Middle East. And the Iranians, for economic reasons, they also are seeking stability. And that's why the interests of two sides have aligned to get this detainee deal, along with some de-escalation in the region.
Seyed, what do you make of Ali's analysis there of the position of the government in Tehran right now?
I believe the regime change notion has existed since 1979, and if you review the Iran revolution during last 42 years, you would see there has been a lot of events like the war, like demonstrations in 1997, demonstrations in 2017. And there has been assumption that the regime is going to collapse, but it never happened. I think the security establishments, they are on the top of the situation, and the regime change collapse is not going to happen. Nevertheless, I believe they have severe economic problems and even social problems, which they need a decision beyond this deal with the US. This is what they really need to make major reforms on economic, social, and political policies and situation in the country.
So, Seyed, I mean, have this many years of sanctions efforts just failed? I mean, is the U.S. only doing to Iran what it's basically done to Cuba over the decades, and that it's the people that end up suffering, the regime stays?
You know, the problem is that the notion of piecemeal approach have been experienced between Iran and the US during 40 years of hostile relations, and every piecemeal approach have failed. This is the reality. And that's why I'm afraid this is another piecemeal approach, and which may not be sustainable. Yes, you are right. Sanctioning is hurting Iranian nation, the innocent people, the civilians, and the system has been able to resist and to remain. However, if we are going to think about major breakthrough between Iran and the US, they need a grand bargain, you know, because always they have agreed like hostages in Lebanon or war on Afghanistan or even JCPOA, the nuclear deal. Always this has been piecemeal approaches which proved unsuccessful.
Colonel Wilkerson, would you describe it as well as a piecemeal approach that is ultimately failing?
Yes, and I love your analogy with regard to Cuba. I worked Cuba for President Obama, track 2 diplomacy for about 7 years, and our policy is an abysmal failure. And I would say that for some of the same reasons it is vis-a-vis Iran. But let's look at what's happened in Iran. I think that regime has lost legitimacy with the majority of the Iranian people, and it did so in this last attempt to overthrow it, because that's what it was. And it's going to have a hard time, regardless of its ability to bring pressure and to shoot people and kill them in the streets. It's going to have a hard time maintaining itself over the next decade or so. And our policy is really not going to make it happen. It's going to be the Iranian people who make it happen. And I see it happening. I just wonder about what's going to come out of it. Will it be a military dictatorship or some other form of government that might be as bad as or worse than the theologians, as it were?
Okay.
So yes, our policy's been a failure.
Ali Vaez, I need to give you the last minute and a half for your final thoughts. Go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the colonel. Look, the reality is that the Islamic Republic does not have a solution, an answer to the underlying problems that gave rise to the movement last year. And it has only through suppression has been able to buy time. It has not addressed any of the problems. And that means that it has basically just managed to kick the can down the road, which is exactly the same approach that has been used in the current diplomatic track with the US. None of the problems have been resolved. Only both sides have been able to buy time. Okay. Now, my hope is that between now and next year, that they would be able to start negotiating so that they figure out what kind of a successor agreement to the 2015 nuclear deal could be put in place if President Biden is reelected. But that still is not going to resolve the Islamic Republic's problems, which would require fundamental political and structural changes if it is to regain legitimacy and survive. Otherwise, I think it's going to belong to the dustbin of history in the same way that the Soviet Union eventually collapsed.
Okay, Ali, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank sincerely all three of my panelists so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.